The grandfather clock on Olivia Carter's chipped kitchen table chimed its soft tune at 5 in the morning, sounding far too gentle to reflect the anxious storm in her heart. In the dim, flickering light overhead, she stared at her cold cup of coffee. Steam long gone, its warmth a thing of the past. She took a tentative sip, only to grimace at the stale taste. For a fleeting moment, she closed her tired eyes, listening to the hush of the early hour. She wondered how she had reached a point in life where the best time of day was the silent stretch before sunrise, when her worries hadn't fully awakened to torment her. Her gaze drifted across the room toward a small bed tucked in the corner, where her 4-year-old son, Theo, slept. A thin blanket half covered his little body, leaving one tiny foot peeking out. Even in slumber, his face glowed with innocence, the gentle pout of his lips reminiscent of a simpler time. It was hard to believe those pink cheeks and long lashes belonged to a child who'd already faced life's toughest trials: a missing father, a mother scraping by, and a home that barely felt stable. Olivia brushed away a tear that threatened to fall. She reminded herself she had no right to cry. A single mother couldn't indulge in tears. Her life was too full of responsibilities, obligations, and an unshakable resolve to protect her son. The steady rhythm of Theo's breathing was both a balm and a burden. Each exhale reminded Olivia of the choices she had made, the ones that led her here, to a cramped apartment in London's outskirts, juggling overdue bills, uncertain job security, and a future she feared was closing in on her. She never planned for this life. Once, she stood poised at the top of her finance class at the University of London. Her professors praised her intellect. Internship offers flooded her inbox. But one fateful encounter changed her destiny forever. She remembered that night more vividly than she wanted to admit: the clink of crystal champagne glasses at a prestigious financial gala, the twinkling city lights, and the conversation with a man whose very name made the room go silent in awe. John Sterling, billionaire, finance prodigy, a figure whose presence commanded attention wherever he stepped. For years after, she tried to erase his memory, but the face of her son refused to let her forget. Theo's startlingly deep blue eyes, so much like John's, were a constant reminder of a fleeting connection. Just thinking of it made her stomach twist into knots. Olivia's sigh cut through the stillness, and she carefully rose from her seat. It was nearly 5:10 a.m. Time to begin the daily routine, prepare a simple breakfast, lay out Theo's school uniform, and ready herself for another long shift at Sterling Enterprises. The irony stung. She worked for the very corporation that bore his name. She often wondered if fate was cruel or simply playing a joke at her expense. Yet she had never seen him in person at the building. As CEO, he was leagues above her humble position as an administrative assistant. She wondered if he even knew her name. Glancing at her watch, she stepped over to Theo's bed. The alarm on her phone hadn't chimed yet, but she wanted to wake him gently. She placed a hand on his back, feeling the warmth of his small body through the thin blanket. "Theo," she whispered, smiling through her exhaustion. "Time to get up, little man." He stirred, blinking sleepily, and peered at her with those disarmingly familiar blue eyes. "Mommy," he said, voice still heavy with dreams. Within the next half hour, she had him washed, dressed in a modest uniform, and nibbling on buttered toast. His fingers clenched around a paper napkin as he recounted some fantastical story about a dinosaur from the picture books at preschool. Olivia nodded, half listening, half lost in her thoughts about the day ahead. She dreaded the mounting bills on the counter, an endless array of envelopes demanding payment. Her paycheck from Sterling Enterprises covered the basics, but lately it was never enough. There was the rent, Theo's school fees, groceries, utility bills. Every month she fell a bit further behind, carrying the weight alone. And yet she wore a brave face whenever Theo looked at her. She wouldn't burden him with adult problems. He was 4, for heaven's sake. He needed a carefree childhood, or at least the illusion of one. She cleared her throat. "Finish up, honey. We have to catch the bus soon." He scarfed down the last of the toast, his cheeks puffed out like a chipmunk. She ruffled his hair, feeling an unexpected surge of tenderness. If nothing else, at least they had each other. By 6:30, they were bustling out the door, her cheap phone in one hand, her small purse slung over her shoulder. Theo clutched a well-worn dinosaur plush toy, refusing to leave it behind. The early morning chill nipped at them both as they made their way down the creaking stairs of the apartment complex. Outside, the sky was a pale gray, the sun barely a suggestion on the horizon. Olivia felt a small wave of relief that the bus stop was only a block away. Then her phone rang. She frowned, glancing at the screen. It was Miss Thompson, the elderly neighbor who sometimes babysat Theo whenever he was out of school or she had to work late. Olivia answered with a sense of foreboding. "Olivia, I'm so sorry." Miss Thompson's voice quivered on the other end. "I can't watch Theo today. My daughter's in the hospital and I need to go immediately." Olivia's stomach dropped. "Oh, my. I'm sorry to hear that. I understand," she managed, feeling guilt gnaw at her for even thinking about her own problems at a time like this. "I hope she'll be all right. Please let me know if you need anything." Hanging up, she froze in place. No babysitter. None of her friends were available on such short notice. She glanced at Theo, who was happily bouncing on his toes, clueless to the crisis. Work. She had no vacation days left, and if she missed another shift, she risked losing her job altogether. Sterling Enterprises was strict. Lateness or absences weren't tolerated easily. A wave of desperation swept over her. She had precisely 15 minutes before she had to be at work. The commute took at least 20 if traffic was merciful. With a sinking heart, she realized there was only one option. "Theo," she said softly, "Mommy might need you to come with me to work today, okay?" He blinked but nodded, as if it were a grand adventure. She forced a half-smile, ignoring the dread pooling in her chest. The bus ride to central London felt endless. Every time the bus hit a red light, Olivia checked her phone, panic brimming. By the time they reached the towering Sterling Enterprises building, she was already 10 minutes late. Guilt jabbed at her sides. She hurriedly adjusted Theo's coat, took a deep breath and stepped through the revolving doors, praying nobody would notice the small child trailing behind her. In the sleek, marble-floored lobby, employees in pressed suits and polished shoes zoomed by with single-minded focus. No one paused to greet Olivia or question the presence of her son. Perhaps it was too chaotic, or perhaps they simply didn't care. Either way, relief flickered for a moment. She tugged Theo along, glancing nervously at the security guard who barely lifted his head from the computer screen. She exhaled. So far, so good. They slipped into an elevator with mirrored walls. Olivia pressed the button for the 14th floor, her department's office. The ride up felt like a slow ascent into potential disaster. She prayed her manager wouldn't appear out of nowhere. Theo clung to her, eyes wide at the reflective surfaces all around them, and she mustered her best reassuring smile. "Just stay by Mommy, okay?" she whispered. He nodded solemnly. When the doors parted, she shuffled him into her small cubicle. The entire floor was a sea of identical partitions and muted phone chatter. "Sit here," she urged, pointing to an empty chair in her workspace. She gave him a coloring book from her bag, hoping it would hold his attention for at least a few hours. Then, switching on her computer, she began the day's work with shaky hands. If she could keep Theo quietly occupied until lunch, maybe she could sneak out and drop him at Miss Thompson's once her crisis was resolved. But fate had other plans. As she dove into spreadsheets, answering phone calls and responding to emails, her eyes darted to Theo every few minutes. Eventually, a colleague approached with paperwork. The brief distraction was enough. When she turned around, her heart stopped. Theo's chair was empty. A sinking wave of dread coursed through Olivia's veins. "Theo!" she hissed, rising from her seat so quickly that her knee banged against the desk. Pain registered only as a dull throb compared to the surge of fear coursing through her chest. She scanned the immediate area, but the rows of cubicles all looked the same. Gray panels, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. There was no sign of a small child with a dinosaur plush in hand. Her pulse pounded loudly in her ears. She apologized hastily to a nearby coworker who stared at her with a puzzled expression. Without giving a fuller explanation, she darted between cubicles, calling Theo's name under her breath. It was all she could do to keep from shouting outright. The last thing she needed was to alert management to the fact that she'd brought a child into the office. Meanwhile, 4 floors above, in the executive corridors, John Sterling ended a phone call and handed off a folder to his assistant. His days were typically choreographed down to the minute. Meet executives, sign contracts, field calls from global clients. He rarely ventured to the lower floors. Instead, he ruled from on high, a solitary figure behind tinted glass. He'd cultivated that aloofness intentionally. Emotions and attachments had no place in a life dedicated to expansion and business triumphs. He stepped into the hallway, lost in thought, projecting the aura of a man who had it all together. Then, as he turned a corner, a small figure barreled into his legs. A child. John's reflexes saved him from toppling. He planted his polished shoes firmly on the marble floor, grabbing hold of the boy's shoulders to steady him. "Hey, easy," he murmured, annoyance creeping into his voice. But the moment their eyes met, his breath snagged. The boy had wide, startled eyes, a shade of blue so deep John might have found them striking, had he not been so confused. A corporate office was no place for children, especially unaccompanied ones. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice edged with both curiosity and disapproval. The child's lips parted. For a moment, John saw indecision flicker on the boy's face. Then the boy's gaze latched onto John's own eyes, as though recognizing something profound. Without warning, the little boy's face brightened into a grin. "Daddy!" he exclaimed, voice echoing in the otherwise hushed corridor. In a heartbeat, tiny arms latched onto John's leg. The plush dinosaur tumbled to the floor. John stiffened, completely at a loss. He prided himself on controlling every situation. But there was no policy or boardroom strategy for a child, some stranger's child, clinging to his leg, calling him Daddy. A hush fell across the corridor. Passing executives slowed, their eyes flicking between John's rigid form and the small boy hugging him as if he were a long-lost father. Their astonishment was palpable. No one had ever seen John in any personal situation, let alone one this bizarre. John swallowed, his jaw taut. "Child, you're mistaken," he said, voice oddly tight. Inside, something twisted uncomfortably, a pang that felt foreign. He was certain he'd never laid eyes on this boy before. Before he could gently pry the child loose, the echo of high-heeled footsteps broke the tension. "Theo," a woman's voice cried, laced with desperation. Olivia Carter ran down the corridor, her cheeks flushed, heart hammering, eyes wild with relief and fear. When she registered the scene before her, it felt as though the world dropped out from under her. Of all people for Theo to latch onto, it had to be him, John Sterling, the one man she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Time slowed as she locked eyes with him, terror flooding her features. She noticed the expression on his face, a mix of confusion, deepening suspicion, and something akin to shock. "Mr. Sterling," she managed, her voice wavering. I'm sorry. My son wandered off. Let me take him." She reached for Theo, her movements shaky as though any sudden motion might trigger an explosion. John's gaze pinned her. He felt something churn in the pit of his stomach. There was a familiarity about this woman, her long-lashed eyes, the trembling line of her mouth. Without relinquishing his stoic front, he gently disentangled himself. "Your son called me Daddy," he said, the words echoing with pointed curiosity. Olivia's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like a cornered animal, desperate to bolt, yet forced to stand her ground. She pressed Theo against her side protectively, swallowing hard. He's just confused, she said finally, her voice tight and unconvincing. John studied them. Her pale face, the child's thick lashes and big blue eyes. A flicker of suspicion tightened his features. He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but a swirl of onlookers, once silently gawking, began whispering. Aware of their stares, John jerked his head toward his private office. "In here," he commanded, stepping aside for Olivia and Theo to enter. The single mother gulped but followed. She had no choice. Inside the sprawling suite, floor-to-ceiling windows displayed London's skyline under morning light. The office itself was impeccably furnished. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, glass shelves lined with accolades. Normally, the grandeur impressed visitors into speechlessness, but Olivia's mind was elsewhere. She only felt dread snaking through her. John shut the door, his expression unreadable. Theo clung to Olivia's leg, sensing his mother's fear. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then John's gaze slid to the boy, who peeked at him with a curious tilt of his head. "Start talking," he said at last, quietly, yet with authority that brooked no argument. "Why did he—" He gestured to Theo. "Call me that?" Olivia, her mouth dry, managed to straighten her posture. Years of living on her own terms had taught her to appear braver than she felt. "It was a mistake," she forced out. I'm sorry. I promise it won't happen again. Please, let me return to my desk. I don't want to cause a scene, Mr. Sterling." He cocked his head, clearly unconvinced. "A mistake?" he echoed. His eyes, those same deep assessing eyes, bored into her. "I've never seen him before, and he's never seen me. Children don't usually hug strangers and call them daddy." A muscle in his jaw ticked, an outward sign of a tumult within. "You are Olivia, correct? I've seen your name on employee rosters." His memory for detail was near photographic. That he recalled her name from thousands of employees only intensified the moment's tension. She grimaced. "Yes." Olivia Carter. She paused, measuring her next words as if they were precious currency. "I only started a few years ago in the administrative department." She prayed he hadn't dug further into her file, prayed he didn't recall anything connecting them to that fateful night. His gaze flicked to Theo again. "How old is he?" The question landed like a punch to her gut. She hesitated. "He's 4, she replied, voice faltering. Immediately she regretted it. 4. The timeline. It practically sang out a truth she had tried desperately to conceal. She saw the shadow cross John's features. He did the mental math in seconds. He was too sharp not to. He took a slow breath, turning toward the massive window as though to gather his thoughts. 4, he repeated, so softly it was almost a whisper. "That's interesting." Outside, the city shimmered in daylight, but it felt as if thunderclouds were rolling in. Crouching, he leveled his gaze with the child's. "Theo, is it?" The boy nodded shyly, hugging his dinosaur. John's tone softened just a fraction. "Why did you call me Daddy?" Theo blinked, brows knitting in confusion. "You have eyes just like mine," he said, as if that simple fact explained everything. "Mommy always says my eyes are like my daddy's, but I never met him." He shrugged as only a child could, bright innocence shining through. "But you have the same ones, so I thought maybe—" Olivia's blood turned cold. The truth was erupting from Theo's lips like a tidal wave. She quickly placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That's enough, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to go." John's eyes locked onto hers, understanding dawning, like a puzzle piece falling into place. Olivia saw the flicker of rage, betrayal, maybe even heartbreak ripple through him. Though it was ephemeral, gone in a blink, she recognized it. This was no longer just an awkward misunderstanding in his eyes. There was a strong possibility that the child was his. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "you've been working in my company while hiding—" This? She tried to maintain composure, but her voice came out shaky. Mr. Sterling, I don't want any trouble. Theo and I manage just fine on our own. I'm sorry if we, caused any inconvenience. I'll accept any disciplinary action, but please don't involve him in it. She cringed at how pathetic she sounded, but she'd do anything to protect Theo, even if it meant losing the job she desperately needed. John's expression hardened. This conversation is far from over, Ms. Carter. Take Theo back downstairs, but I will expect to see you in my office at closing time. We need to discuss formalities. The unspoken threat lingered in the air. A DNA test, custody battles, legal storms. She could practically hear the machinery of John Sterling's mind clicking into place. She swallowed, picking Theo up in her arms. He clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder as if sensing tension. All right, she managed. Thank you. She didn't know what she was thanking him for, perhaps just for letting them leave without immediate confrontation. As she exited, her legs felt like lead. Every step pounded home the realization that the secret she'd guarded for nearly 5 years was on the verge of exploding. Overhead, the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz ominously as if echoing the chaos in her thoughts. Once outside John's door, she hurried, nearly jogging back to her cubicle. Her coworkers glanced at her curiously, but none dared ask about the child in her arms. She settled him onto a chair, heart still racing. For a few moments she simply stared at him, a silent apology trembling on her lips. He looked up, blinking. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he whispered, eyes damp. "I won't call anyone Daddy again." Olivia forced a weak smile, stroking his hair. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "You did nothing wrong, nothing at all." But her mind churned. What now? She dreaded the end of the workday, the meeting that awaited her in the top-floor office of a man who had every right to question her, a man who once shared a night she could never forget, and a man who might suddenly realize he had a son. In the hush of late afternoon, Olivia could barely concentrate on her tasks. Emails blurred on her screen. Her phone rang twice and she answered on autopilot, her usual composure absent. Theo sat quietly in the corner with coloring books, no doubt sensing the tension radiating from his mother. Guilt gnawed at Olivia. She had tried so hard to provide a normal life for him. Now, all those carefully built walls threatened to collapse. Time crawled. 5 o'clock loomed. Olivia found herself dreading the moment she would have to walk to the executive suites. She imagined 1,000 horrible outcomes. John demanding a DNA test, firing her on the spot, or worse, claiming rights to Theo and yanking him away from the only home he knew. She shook off the terrifying thoughts, remembering the cozy nights they'd shared in their modest apartment, reading bedtime stories and laughing at silly knock-knock jokes. She would die before letting anyone take that away from her. When the clock finally ticked 5:01, she felt a chill coil at the base of her spine. Gathering her meager courage, she stood. "Theo," she said gently, "you'll come with Mommy, okay?" He looked up, eyes tired but trusting. "Are we going home?" he asked softly. "Soon," she whispered, forcing a reassuring nod. Together, they walked to the elevator that would carry them to the upper floors of Sterling Enterprises, John Sterling's domain. Her stomach lurched when the doors opened to a luxurious reception area. Plush chairs, abstract art on the walls, an air of hushed exclusivity. John's assistant, an impeccably dressed woman, offered Olivia a tight smile. "Mr. Sterling is waiting." Olivia nodded, gulping. She clutched Theo's hand and, with a sense of foreboding, entered the office. John stood by the wall-to-ceiling windows overlooking London's skyline. In the amber glow of evening, the city shimmered beneath the setting sun, traffic lights winking below. He turned slowly, his posture rigid, eyes troubled. At that moment, Olivia caught a glimpse of something beyond the typical coldness, maybe fear or perhaps regret. But as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared, replaced by a stony mask. Her voice trembled. "Mr. Sterling, we're here." The tension was thick enough to choke on. John nodded once and gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. She lowered herself carefully, lifting Theo into her lap to hold him close. The boy seemed uncharacteristically quiet, absorbing the atmosphere. John circled around the desk, his gaze flicking between mother and child. Finally, he spoke, each word clipped. "We need to settle this situation like adults. I don't appreciate being deceived, Olivia." She swallowed. Deceived. The word hung in the air, fueling her guilt. She mustered what composure she could. "I never intended to deceive you," she said, voice tight. I didn't know how to tell you, or if I even should." "Why?" he demanded, a flash of frustration crossing his face. "Why would you hide a child from me? If there was even the possibility—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Olivia lowered her gaze, tears pricking her eyes. She'd spent so many nights agonizing over whether to track him down, but the memory of that morning, when she woke in an empty bed, John long gone, still burned. He'd vanished without a note, leaving her to interpret it as rejection. "I didn't know how to find you," she murmured, "and I wasn't sure you would care. You left." Anger flared briefly in her tone, but she reminded herself to remain calm. "I didn't want to disrupt your life. I thought I could manage on my own." John exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "I left that morning because—" He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he'd barricaded for years. "It doesn't matter now," he muttered, voice taut. "What matters is that I have a right to know if Theo is mine." Theo perked up at his name, glancing between them in confusion. Olivia bit her lip. She'd dreaded this moment from the day she discovered her pregnancy. But maybe it was time. She couldn't maintain the lie, especially not with John's resources. "Please, just let me explain," she whispered. Stroking Theo's hair, she guided his attention to the crayons in her purse. The boy obediently started coloring on a fresh page, as though sensing adult words he wasn't meant to hear. Then, in a voice trembling with vulnerability, Olivia recounted the story of her pregnancy, how she'd tried to finish her degree, how the morning after that fateful night left her alone and uncertain. She told him about the scholarships she lost, the menial jobs she worked, and the endless nights of doubt and exhaustion. John listened in silence, fists clenching. Each word seemed to chip away at something in him, a callousness he'd honed to protect himself from exactly this kind of emotional entanglement. When she finished, the hush was deafening, broken only by the soft scratch of Theo's crayon on paper. "Olivia," John said quietly, the edge in his voice tempered by something new, regret, perhaps. "I never intended. If I had known—" He stopped as if the words themselves weighed too much. "Why did you join my company?" he asked finally, curiosity creeping into the question. "It's the last place I'd expect someone trying to avoid me to show up." She offered a mirthless laugh. "It's London's largest financial corporation. It hired me as an administrative assistant despite my incomplete degree, and the pay was better than most places. I never thought I'd run into you here. It's a big company." She paused. "I didn't have the luxury to be picky." John's gaze flickered toward Theo, whose little brow was knit in concentration as he colored a bright dinosaur. "Well," John murmured, exhaling slowly, "we need to confirm paternity. I'm sure you can understand that I can't just accept your word. Not now." She bristled at his implication but nodded. "I do understand. But," she added, her chin lifting, "Theo's life is not a game or a business transaction. If you confirm he's yours, what then? You can't just barge in and take him away. He's my world." Her voice quivered with desperation. A flicker of hurt lit in his eyes. "I'm not heartless, Olivia, but I won't be shut out of my child's life either. Once we have proof, I have every intention of being involved. As a father." The last words seemed foreign to him, as if he'd never pictured himself in that role. Their eyes locked, hers filled with protective fire, his with a determined steel. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of how high the stakes were. Olivia realized that if the test came back positive, everything would shift. Her fragile independence might crumble beneath John's influence, his wealth, and the emotional complexities she'd struggled to bury. She swallowed, nodding stiffly. "Fine. We'll arrange the test, but I won't let you bulldoze me. I want to keep my job. I want to raise Theo with stability. Understand?" John's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not here to ruin your life, but there will be changes. If he's my son, he deserves more than scraping by in a cramped flat, and you won't have to worry about your job." Despite the sincerity in his tone, Olivia's stomach twisted. She didn't want to owe him anything. Debt to a billionaire, especially one with whom she shared such a tumultuous past, felt dangerous. Suddenly, Theo let out a giggle, showcasing the picture he'd just colored. A dinosaur with bright purple stripes. "Mommy, look," he said excitedly. The tension in the air dissolved for a split second as both adults glanced at the child's creation. John's eyes softened. He'd spent his life negotiating deals worth millions, but never had a scribbled drawing pulled at his heart so powerfully. "Let's do the paternity test tomorrow," John said, turning back to Olivia. "I'll arrange it with my medical contacts. They're discreet." She hesitated, but nodded. Fighting it would be pointless. It was inevitable. If the test revealed the truth, she hoped John's claims of wanting to protect Theo were genuine, because if he turned out to be a manipulative force, she had no idea how she would shield her son. John rose from his chair, a silent signal that the meeting was over. "I'll have my assistant coordinate with you. Thank you for agreeing." Olivia stood as well, guiding Theo by the hand. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Just be gentle with him. He's still a child," she pleaded softly. John gave a curt nod, but his gaze flicked to Theo again. In those few seconds, an almost imperceptible tenderness crossed his face, as though he recognized how fragile and precious the little boy was. "I will," he said quietly. On the elevator ride down, Olivia felt drained. Theo leaned against her, half asleep from a day of excitement and confusion. Tomorrow would bring a test that might confirm the bond she already suspected. In her arms, she held the only family she'd known for years. Up above, in that towering office, was a man who could either become an ally she never expected or a threat she couldn't repel. She slipped her arm around Theo's shoulders. Whatever happened, they would face it together. She wanted to believe that. Deep inside, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, John Sterling wasn't the same cold man she remembered, and that even the hardest hearts could learn to love when given the reason. The following day, a discreet black sedan arrived at Olivia's apartment early in the morning to ferry her and Theo to a private medical clinic. The car itself was a stark reminder that John's world existed on a plane she had never known. She swallowed her anxiety, holding Theo's hand as they stepped into the plush interior. The driver greeted them politely and navigated London's bustling streets with smooth efficiency. Theo, blissfully ignorant of the turmoil swirling around him, gazed out the window, fascinated by passing landmarks. Big Ben, the Thames, the hustle of morning crowds. Olivia, however, was a bundle of nerves. She tried to steady her breathing. Soon, the test. A few swabs of saliva or a simple blood sample, and she'd no longer be able to shield Theo from the reality that John Sterling might be his father. At the clinic, tucked into a quiet lane away from prying eyes, John waited, leaning against the reception desk. He looked every inch the powerful businessman, though there was an uncharacteristic tension about him. When he saw Olivia and Theo, his otherwise stoic face softened. He approached them, kneeling to Theo's level. "Good morning," he said gently. "Ready for a quick checkup?" Theo, unafraid, nodded. "Mommy says I have to take a test. Will it hurt?" His gaze darted nervously between John and Olivia. John shook his head. "Just a little swab in your mouth, that's all." He paused, glancing at Olivia. "Right?" She managed a thin smile. "Right, sweetie. It's just like brushing your teeth." The test took only a few minutes. A friendly technician swabbed Theo's cheek, then John's, then Olivia's for good measure. Afterward, they waited. The tension built with each ticking second. At last, the door opened and the technician handed a sealed envelope to John, face carefully neutral. "The results," she said, "strictly confidential, as requested." John thanked her, stepping aside to pry open the envelope. Olivia cradled Theo, who began to squirm impatiently. With trembling fingers, John scanned the data. His jaw clenched, eyes flicking to Olivia, then settling on the child. "He's mine," he said softly, voice colored with awe, fear, and a glimmer of joy. "Theo is my son." Olivia's heart squeezed. Even though she expected this, hearing it spoken aloud changed something irrevocably. She locked her gaze on John, searching for any sign of malice or aggression. Instead, she found something else, a raw, vulnerable expression that she never imagined could appear on the face of a ruthless billionaire. "We should talk," Olivia said quietly. They both thanked the staff and returned to the clinic's waiting area. Theo ran to the corner, enthralled by a small aquarium filled with colorful fish. John and Olivia stood on opposite sides of a glossy coffee table, each wrestling with conflicting emotions. John was the first to break the silence. "I'm not going to pretend I know how to be a father," he admitted, voice subdued, "but I'm certain of one thing. I want to be in Theo's life, and I want to support you, both of you, properly." Olivia exhaled, a wave of relief mixing with apprehension. "I'm not against it," she said, "but Theo's safety and well-being come first. I don't want him to become a pawn in corporate games or be exposed to things a 4-year-old shouldn't see." John rubbed the back of his neck, nodding. "I understand. I might not be used to family life, but I'd never exploit my own son." He glanced over at Theo, who giggled at a clownfish darting around the aquarium. A faint smile touched John's lips. "He's amazing. It kills me that I missed the last 4 years." A pang of empathy speared Olivia's heart. She realized that, while her struggles as a single mother had been immense, John had his own regrets. "You can't change the past," she said gently, "but you can shape the future, if you're willing to try." "Thank you." His eyes, brimming with complex emotion, returned to hers. "Let's figure out a plan. I know your living situation is tough. Let me help. Find you a better apartment, nearer to the city, or—" She shook her head firmly. "Number. You're not swooping in with money to fix everything. I've worked hard to stand on my own feet. I'm not letting go of that independence overnight." He raised both hands in a placating gesture. "All right, but at least consider moving somewhere safer. London's outskirts can be rough. Think of Theo. He deserves a neighborhood where he can play without worry." She hesitated, remembering the broken elevator in her current building, the flickering hallway lights, the suspicious characters lurking around corners. "I'll think about it," she conceded. "But let's go one step at a time." Her voice softened. "John, thank you for wanting to do this. I was afraid you'd try to take him." He frowned. "That would never have been my intention. I've been ruthless in business, yes. But this is different. This is my son." The tenderness in his tone surprised her. Surprised them both. Eager to move forward, they decided to meet regularly so John could spend time with Theo. The ride back to her apartment was quiet, each lost in thought. Theo, buckled in the back seat, dozed off with his dinosaur plush toy cradled to his chest. Days turned into weeks, and a delicate new routine began to form. Sometimes John visited Olivia's cramped apartment, seated awkwardly on a rickety chair, reading to Theo from picture books. Other times, he invited them to a park or a children's museum, paying close attention to Theo's curiosity, encouraging him with gentle praise. Initially, Olivia hovered protectively, mistrust flickering in her eyes, but she found herself moved by John's genuine warmth toward their child. Slowly, their little boy began calling John Dad with more certainty, each syllable dissolving a layer of John's former detachment. He still managed his corporation with an iron will, but behind closed doors, he started discovering the simple joys of fatherhood, like wiping sticky ice cream from Theo's chin or swinging him high into the air amid squeals of glee. For Olivia, watching John adapt to fatherhood felt surreal. The man who had once vanished without a goodbye was now leaving early from board meetings to catch Theo's preschool art show. He even stepped into her world at times, sitting with her at her kitchen table, flipping through bills and quietly offering advice on budgeting. While she resisted outright financial dependence, a small part of her felt relief. At last, she wasn't alone. Yet unease lingered. The more time they spent together, the more she feared the day something or someone might rip them apart. Sterling Enterprises was rife with internal politics, corporate sharks always circling. What if the press discovered John's hidden son? How would the board of directors react? Worse, what if the reemergence of old business enemies threatened Theo's safety? One afternoon, a confrontation brewed that exposed Olivia's underlying worries. They were in John's penthouse for the first time, an opulent space with panoramic city views, modern furniture, and an unmistakable aura of luxury. Theo was enthralled by the floor-to-ceiling windows, pointing out tiny cars on the roads below. Meanwhile, Olivia admired the tasteful art pieces on the walls but felt out of place, as if stepping into a fairy tale castle without any right to be there. John emerged from the kitchen with a tray of juice. "I've never really served anything in my own home before," he admitted, somewhat embarrassed. "House staff usually handles that, but I sent them away for privacy." Olivia offered him a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, sipping the juice. She watched as John sat across from her, eyes gliding to where Theo trotted around the living room. Quietly, he said, "I could see you and Theo living somewhere like this. Spacious, safe, with a view." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" He nodded, a flicker of longing in his gaze. "I want you both to have the best. You're my family, whether you accept that or not. I missed 4 years, but I don't want to miss another day." Her heart fluttered. The word family felt both comforting and terrifying. "John," she began, placing her glass down, "it's not that simple. We're still working through a lot." She glanced at Theo, who was currently fascinated by a small statue near the window. She lowered her voice, continuing, "I'm worried about the future. If this becomes public knowledge, an heir to your fortune, there might be consequences." His jaw tightened. "I can handle the media. I won't let them near Theo. We can maintain privacy." The confidence in his tone was absolute, but she wasn't convinced. Sterling Enterprises had eyes and ears everywhere. A single leaked photo of John pushing a stroller would set tabloids ablaze. "And what about your board of directors?" she pressed gently. "What if they worry about your focus shifting? You're the pillar of the company. They might see Theo as a distraction or use him to manipulate you." A flicker of anger sparked in John's eyes. "If any of them dare use my son as leverage, I'll tear down everything they hold dear. I built this empire. I can rebuild it as I wish." A harsh finality colored his words, reminding her of his ruthless side. But then he exhaled, shaking his head. "Sorry," he muttered. "I don't mean to sound harsh. It's just, I found something more important than the company. I refuse to lose it." Olivia's chest tightened. She saw sincerity and fear swirling behind his eyes. The same fear she carried. They both stood at the edge of a precipice, ready to either leap forward together or fall apart. The gentle squeals of Theo, enthralled by the shimmering cityscape, reminded her of the real reason they were there, their son. Reaching out, she placed her hand on top of John's. He stilled, meeting her gaze. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, choosing to trust the moment. "But let's do it carefully, step by step." John nodded, his hand gently squeezing hers. "Yes, step by step." Life soon settled into a tender, if precarious, balance. John arranged his schedule to spend evenings with Theo whenever possible. They visited the zoo and museums. They strolled through parks feeding ducks. Other times they simply stayed at Olivia's cramped apartment, sharing a humble dinner while John learned to handle everyday tasks like washing dishes or listening to Theo's bedtime routine. The initial awkwardness softened into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. At Sterling Enterprises, rumors circulated. Some employees whispered about John's sudden interest in the administrative floors. Others reported glimpses of a child who resembled the CEO. Olivia braced herself daily for an onslaught of gossip, but John's influence kept matters relatively contained. People feared him enough not to pry openly. Still, she knew it was only a matter of time before this growing secret breached the surface. That breach came on a stormy afternoon. Olivia was tidying up her cubicle, ready to pick Theo up from preschool, when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was frantic. "Ms. Carter, it's the preschool. Theo had a headache and he fainted. The ambulance is on its way." Her world spun. She scarcely remembered telling her manager she had to leave. She stumbled to the lobby, searching for a cab, heart hammering. Lightning flashed across the sky, thunder rumbling in the distance, but none of it registered. Her thoughts reeled. Theo fainted. He's never done that before. Please, let him be okay. Without hesitation, she dialed John. His voice was tense the moment he picked up. "What's wrong?" She couldn't form complete sentences. "Theo. Fainted. Hospital. She heard him curse softly and then say, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." Minutes later, his car screeched to a halt in front of Sterling Enterprises. She climbed in, drenched from the sudden downpour. They sped through London streets, weaving between cars as John gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight with worry. The rain pelted the windshield, the city blurred by fear. At the hospital, they found Theo in a small emergency room bed, awake but pale. A kindly doctor explained that it seemed like a severe migraine combined with dehydration. "We'll run some tests to be sure," the doctor said, gently patting Olivia's shoulder. "He's stable now. Might be stress, might be a nutritional deficiency. Has he been particularly anxious or skipping meals?" Overwhelmed, Olivia glanced at John, who stood behind her, face etched with guilt. She mumbled something about how they'd been so busy adjusting to new schedules that maybe they hadn't watched Theo's diet as closely. John's expression darkened and he gently ruffled Theo's hair. "We'll take better care of you, buddy," he murmured. The truth sank in for Olivia. She'd juggled too many balls at once. Her job, fear of being outed, tension around John's role, all while not noticing Theo's increasing fatigue. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. She was Theo's guardian, and she had to do better. She turned to John and found him equally shaken. In that moment, they silently vowed to be more attentive, more open to sharing the load. Theo recovered quickly, a resilient child with a bright spirit. After a few hours of tests and monitoring, he was laughing again, coloring on the hospital bed's tray table. But the incident forced Olivia and John to confront a hard truth. Their current arrangement was tenuous. Theo's needs had to come first, no matter how complicated their own feelings or circumstances were. That night, after Theo was discharged, John drove them back to Olivia's place. The storm had subsided, leaving the streets glistening with puddles that reflected city lights. As they climbed the rickety stairs, John's gaze flicked over the peeling paint and dim light bulbs that buzzed in the corridors. He said nothing, but the disapproval was evident in his tight-lipped frown. Inside, once Theo was tucked into bed, John cornered Olivia in the small living room. "We can't keep living like this. On edge, in constant fear, he began, tone urgent. He's our son, and he deserves better. Let's move you into a safer apartment. Now I'll pay the deposit, the rent, everything. Think of it as an investment in his well-being, not a handout. Olivia bristled at the suggestion of charity, but the memory of Theo in a hospital bed gnawed at her. Could she cling to her pride at the expense of their son's environment? She clasped her hands, torn. I don't want to feel indebted. I'm used to standing on my own 2 feet. John's voice softened. We're a family, Olivia. Doesn't that mean we stand together? You don't have to carry everything alone. The word family made her eyes sting. She turned away, hugging herself. What if something changes? She whispered. What if we fight, or you lose interest, or your board demands you step away from us? He exhaled, stepping closer. I won't let them dictate my personal life. You and Theo are not some passing whim. I realize that now. My entire life I avoided attachments, worried they'd make me vulnerable. But look where we are. I'm already vulnerable because I love him, and I'm starting to... He paused, voice catching. I'm starting to care for you again, too. She turned, eyes brimming with unshed tears. Again? He nodded solemnly. I never forgot that night, Olivia. I left for reasons that now seem foolish. Fear, pride, not wanting to appear weak. I was wrong. I should have stayed. The weight of those words left them both trembling in the cramped living room, neon city lights glowing through thin curtains. Slowly, he reached out, taking her hand. She didn't pull away. I'm sorry, he murmured. Give me a chance to prove we can be a real family. She answered by leaning against him, letting her forehead rest on his shoulder. All right, she whispered. We'll move, for Theo. But also, maybe, for us. He held her close, the moment tender, each of them breathing in relief, hope, and the warmth of a connection they'd both longed for. Over the next weeks, John made good on his word. He found a modest yet comfortable apartment in a safer neighborhood, close to good schools and with a sunny bedroom for Theo. Olivia settled in with an uneasy blend of gratitude and nerves. She continued her job at Sterling Enterprises, determined not to become dependent on John's wealth. But as they spent evenings in the new home, with Theo rummaging through moving boxes, laughter echoing off freshly painted walls, Olivia felt something unfamiliar. Contentment. One evening, after Theo had gone to sleep, John lingered in the living room, rummaging through boxes still to be unpacked. He unearthed a photograph, Olivia as a college student, beaming with pride, acceptance letters pinned on a dorm corkboard. He studied it, a faint smile curving his lips. She noticed and joined him, crossing her arms. That was before everything changed, she murmured, a trace of wistfulness in her voice. He turned, placing the photo carefully back. Maybe it's time we revive some of those dreams. You're brilliant with finance, Olivia. My HR department can help you finish your degree or place you in a better role. You deserve a real career, not just an admin desk. She bit her lip. It's been so long. I've forgotten so much. And balancing, Theo. I'll help, he offered gently. Whatever you need. I believe in you. Her eyes shone with tears again. Thank you. I'd like that. Eventually. They fell into a soft hush. Then John took a steadying breath, pulling out a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Her heart flipped. What? She began, but he pressed a finger to her lips, gaze warm. Olivia, these years apart have taught me one lesson. We don't get time back. I nearly lost you both in my ignorance. I don't want to waste another moment. As he opened the box, revealing a delicate ring that sparkled even in the dim light, tears pooled in her eyes. She wasn't sure if it was from the beauty of the ring or the raw emotion on his face. Marry me, he whispered, voice trembling. Let's keep building this family properly. Her breath caught. It was all happening so fast, yet it felt right. Memories of heartbreak warred with new memories of tenderness, trust, and growth. Slowly, she nodded, tears falling onto her cheeks. "Yes," she breathed, a shaky smile lighting her face. He slid the ring onto her finger, then wrapped her in a fierce embrace. Nearby, from the hallway, a small, sleepy voice piped up, "Mommy? Daddy?" They turned to see Theo, rubbing his eyes with a stuffed dinosaur clutched in one hand. "Why are you crying?" he asked, stepping forward. Olivia knelt to scoop him into her arms. "They're happy tears," she whispered, kissing his forehead. John ruffled Theo's hair, smiling. "We're a family now," he said softly. Theo's eyes brightened, a grin spreading across his face. "So, can we celebrate with ice cream tomorrow?" The two adults laughed, heads tilting back in relief and joy. John scooped Theo into a warm hug, meeting Olivia's teary gaze over his shoulder. Their long and winding journey had led them here. A new home, a beloved child, and a second chance at the love they'd both nearly lost. For a moment, the world beyond their small circle disappeared, leaving only the quiet promise of better days to come. In the weeks that followed, Olivia quietly wore the ring, treasured the early mornings when John would stop by with coffee, and cherished the evenings spent reading Theo bedtime stories. She juggled her job, now with a growing sense of possibility about the future. John, for his part, balanced board meetings with fatherhood, patiently fielding every question from Theo about dinosaurs, planes, and why the sky is blue. For the first time in a long while, Olivia's reflection in the mirror looked peaceful. She wasn't just a single mother scraping by. She was a partner, a fiancée, a woman reclaiming her dreams. And though the road ahead might still hold twists and challenges, they would face them as a family, together. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the beauty in second chances, please consider sharing it with someone who needs hope. And if you believe in the power of family, no matter how unexpected it may form, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories each day. Thank you for being with us, and remember, it's never too late to start over.